Hello, everyone, and welcome to Path 11's Facebook Live this Friday. Many of you know me. I am April Hanna. I am the host of the Path 11 podcast, also the producer of Path 11 TV and our documentaries and all of that stuff. And for the past 3 years, Path 11 Productions has been producing and helping the Afterlife Awareness Conference. And we have the founder, Terry Daniel, who is joining me today for Facebook Live. We've been doing this for about 2 weeks or so, and we just wanted to give you guys some more information about the conference because this conference has been going on for 11 years. This is year 11, but guess what? This is the last year that the Afterlife Conference is going to look how it looks. And our founder, Terry Daniel, will talk a little bit more about that. So we wanted to hop on live and have one more discussion because the conference is right around the corner. It is happening next week. It is finally here, June 24th through the 27th. We have tickets for sale. Afterlifeconference.com is where you can find them. It'll be through Eventbrite, and it's actually a live event. So you'll have the opportunity to talk to all the presenters. We have a Q&A time usually after every single presentation. It's a beautiful community of so many people that come year after year. I've made friends with some of the presenters and people who attend. So it's just been really great. Wonderful for anyone who clearly has experienced any type of grief or loss of someone, or is really curious about why are we here, what's our purpose, is there life after death, and just really trying to answer some of those big questions, as you know, Path 11 is always trying to do. So the Afterlife Conference is a perfect fit for us. So Terry, hello, and welcome to our last Facebook Live here for this month. How are you doing today?
For this month, for this year, for this conference.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So let's talk about it. So I know that, like anything, we have to continue to keep changing. So can you, just in case people are just logging on for the very first time and they've never seen our faces before and they have never heard of the Afterlife Conference, can you talk about the reason why you started it, what it's been about for these past 11 years, and then how you're going to be moving a little bit more in a different direction?
Yeah, well, actually started 12 years ago when I heard about a conference by a big group, a national group for bereaved parents called the Compassionate Friends. Many of you may know who they are. And they were having a conference, and it's all about, grief and death and all of that for parents who've lost children, of which I am one. So I asked them if I could come and speak at their conference. I had just come out with my first book, A Swan in Heaven, which was about communications that I received from my son after he died. And they said, absolutely not. We don't allow anybody to talk about that because that's very upsetting to our parents because they wonder why they're not getting communications. And it's too spiritual and it's too religious and we don't talk about that. So they really slapped me down hard. And I found out that other people who had books out in those days, like Bill Guggenheim, who wrote Hello from Heaven, Sandy Goodman, who wrote Love Never Dies, had also tried to speak at that conference and were turned away for the same reason. So I said, well, heck, I'm just going to start my own conference. And that's how it started. So I started planning it in 2009. The first actual conference was 2011, March. And it was very small and very wonderful. And we had all those people there who had been turned away by the Compassionate Friends. And that's history. It just grew and grew. We kept changing our focus a little bit over the years because I kept changing my focus. I wasn't that much focused on bereavement and messages from the other side as I had been years earlier. So I started to include academic research on death and the afterlife, religious questions like multicultural belief systems about death and the afterlife, and a whole bunch of stuff. And of course, we brought in our shamans who taught us about out-of-body journeying and visions or concepts of the afterlife in some of these indigenous cultures and how to work with that. So that's where it's been. And that's what we've been doing now until now. Conference number 11 starts next week. And we really want you to be there. Afterlifeconference.com is how you will find all the information. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we're going to change the conference going forward. Or did you
Great.
want me to talk about that now, April? Or
No,
we could
actually, because I'd like to maybe ask you just a couple of questions in case
Mhm.
we do have, anyone that's watching that is a parent that has lost someone, and just kind of want to open up my comment box just to remind people that we are live, so you can actually log your questions in the chat box. You can ask Terry any questions. If maybe you are a parent who has lost a child and you would like to say something, please do in the comments. But I actually haven't read your very first book, and I know that it might be old news to you. Like you said, you've kind of moved along, and you're probably in constant communication with your son who has transitioned. Because I think you had said, wasn't he supposed to be 30 this year?
31.
31. Okay.
31 next month, actually.
Okay, 31
Yeah,
next
and
month. So, yeah, would you mind just maybe talking about that? Since
oh,
this is
sure.
kind of the last conference of its kind, and the inspiration that you just shared was about really wanting to talk about the communication that you had with your son after he transitioned. Maybe we should honor that today too. That wasn't the
Okay,
direction we were going to go in, but hey, let's just do it, right?
we
If
can
that's what
do anything we
feels
want.
right.
So that's so yeah. So the whole reason I got interested in this work was obviously because of my son. He died when he was 16. He had a rare metabolic disorder that started when he was about 7. So it was progressively degenerative. He went from being a normal, exceptionally bright, capable kid to all the way to total care, in a wheelchair, unable to speak or move his body in any way. Diapers, he had to be catheterized. He didn't even have the muscle capability to pee toward the end. So it was quite a journey of caregiving. And he lost the ability to talk toward the end. So we sort of started communicating telepathically before he died, which is not unusual because that's how you communicate with your baby before they can talk. And I was working with a teacher, a channeler at the time, and they were giving me amazing readings, and they were saying, this is your plan with this kid. After he dies, he's going to talk to you so much. You won't be able to contain it all. And you're going to write a book and you're going to do this. And that's exactly what happened. And so 30 minutes after he died, I was laying there holding him in my arms. And I said, "Where are you? Can you show me where you are right now? Because I can see that you're not inside this body." And that's when all these visions started to happen, that he showed me himself standing in some shallow water, walking around, kicking the water and playing. And he looked much older. And from that point forward, I was just getting these visions and messages and dictation from him. And so that's what went into the very first book, which is called A Swan in Heaven, which came out in 2010. And it just went on and on from there. Personally, I became a hospice volunteer right after that, and very quickly learned that I wanted to go deeper into that. Let's put it that way. That's the short version. Long story shortened. For the next 10 years, I went to school and I got a degree in religious studies and a degree in pastoral counseling, and did training as a hospice chaplain and counseling and all this stuff. Ended up getting a doctorate degree in pastoral counseling. And so that's what I do now. I do the Afterlife Conference. I teach death and dying and bereavement courses at 2 seminaries. And I do workshops all over the country, which I'm sure most of you know. And you can find all that stuff at my website, spiritualityandgrief.com. And as far as my son, he's sitting right here. He's just kind of everywhere. It's not the same as it was in the beginning. I don't get the long, intense, crystal clear words that I used to get, because it was explained to me this way. If you're a teacher and you're teaching a 7-year-old how to do a math problem, you give him the problem, you teach him some stuff, and then you walk away, you go teach another kid, and you let that kid sit there and do the math work himself. And that's kind of what our loved ones do with us when they fade away after some years, after they're gone, is they give us this big dose of information and technology, really, skills. And then they don't have to breathe down our neck and watch us use those skills every minute of every day. They're around and they're doing other things. I'm not a medium. I can't really speak to the other things that they're doing, but I can only talk about what I've heard through my communications. And again, you'll find all that in our first book, Swan in Heaven. So my last name is Daniel. It wasn't always Daniel because my son's name was Daniel. And after he died, I had my last name legally changed to Daniel.
Wow, I did not know that. That's the first that I'm
really
learning.
cool
That's
thing
so
to do.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is. Well, and I also see, thank you so much for those of you watching on Facebook that shared some information. We look like we have some people here that have also lost children. Another person that receives a lot of incredible signs from her 21-year-old that she communicates all the time with my 20-year-old. She sent so many incredible signs that cannot be denied. And do you find, Terry, with all the work that you've done with bereaved parents, that many times their child's death brings them into this work? I mean, I know clearly that is your case and for you, and maybe not all, but it does feel like a lot of times parents go on to write books or their trajectory just completely changes. What have you seen?
Well, your trajectory changes no matter what. When your child dies, of course your life is going to change. Some people write books just because they have to write about it and get it out of their system. Some people publish those books. Some people get completely involved in being the author of those books and go and do speaking engagements and do that kind of thing. Some people start nonprofit foundations. Everybody does something. I mean, that's kind of what you're supposed to do. That's how you heal, is you allow your life to change and you move into the new world that you are inhabiting as a very changed person, and inspired by and motivated by and moved by that experience of loss. That's not just if your child dies, that's really with any kind of loss or trauma that you could possibly have. So in my personal work, I wrote a bunch of books. I started the conference. I went back to school. I'm now also a hospice chaplain. I help people with their grief and their trauma and their change. And what we look for is something that we call post-traumatic growth. And so if you had a tragic loss, say 3 years ago, and you say to me right now, I haven't grown. I still cry every day. I'm still angry. I am mad at God. Why did God do this to me? And, I can't get out of bed in the morning and I eat too much and I drink too much or whatever. Then you haven't allowed yourself to move into that post-traumatic growth place, and you're in a place that we call complicated grief. That's a whole other conversation. We've done a ton of podcasts about that. If you want to learn more about that whole healing and grieving process, go to our podcast, which we also have, which is called AskDrDeath.com, and doctors spelled out DOCTOR, death. And you'll find a whole bunch of really good content on all these processes that I'm trying to squeeze into a 2-minute description.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point, and I know that we've talked about this before, and I think it might have even been like a podcast that we did last year to promote the conference, but I don't know if it actually aired or not, because I think we did another one. But one of the things that I love that you teach is that you teach people that it's okay to be okay after grief, and that you really do encourage the healing process. And you've touched a lot upon here, what complicated grief may look like. But I know one of your pet peeves has always been when people say, and it was told to me too, that your grief equals the love that you had for the person, and how that can be a very damaging statement to people, because it's like, but if I love them that deeply, then I should be grieving even longer, or that I am not allowed to move forward, like you said, or to have that growth. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it is so important. And I don't think that it's said enough, unless maybe you're really working with a trained grief professional. But you speak so eloquently on that subject that I'd like people to hear it who might stumble upon this Facebook Live even after we're done recording it. So can you talk about that?
So there are a couple of cliches. You know, all the usual cliches. He's in a better place now. He's with Jesus. God wanted another flower for his garden. You know, you get over it, move on. Those are the ones you hear all the time. The ones you don't hear that much are the ones that you hear a lot in grief groups for bereaved parents. And I actually started a Facebook group called Bad Grief Guidance, if any of you want to go and check that out. And I ran into so many parents who have this belief that says the depth of your pain is equal to the depth of the love that you had for your child. And that's just one of the most twisted, unhealthy things I've ever heard, because that means you can never stop being in pain. And I encountered so many people in these parent grief groups who were in what is technically known, it's a technical official clinical diagnosis called complicated grief or prolonged grief syndrome. It has several names, who 5-10 years later are still in deep, crushing pain because they believe if they stop being in pain, then their child will know that they somehow don't love them anymore. And it's a really damaging teaching. There are a lot of other really bad teachings. And, this is one of the problems if you're grieving and you go all over social media looking for support, because you're going to find some really bad stuff from people who have not been trained in grief counseling or grief theory. And they'll say things like, I saw this on a website once. If you love somebody who's going to die and you know they're dying, no matter how bad you think it's going to be, it'll be 1,000,000 times worse. Somebody actually said that on a website. They also said holidays and birthdays and milestones will always be sad. This is bad teaching. Holidays and birthdays and milestones will not always be sad. And when you're caring for someone who's dying, the fact of the actual death when they actually die is not 1,000,000 times worse than you think it's going to be. It's very sad. This is, like you said, April, it's a peeve of mine. People out there with a public platform giving grief advice who don't know what they're talking about, who haven't had any training or done any studying on the wonderful, excellent grief research that's out there, which has been done by people who've been in this field for decades and are, psychologists and psychiatrists and social scientists and people who really know, and, people who are in the field, people who are actually in clinical practice helping people with this every day. So
Right.
Those are the people you want to learn from.
Absolutely. And those are the people who you invite to your conference. And,
Yes.
That's what I really love about the conference. You really handpick people. You are very precise in making those decisions. And you make sure that you have very good, credible, and ethical people who are coming on to speak about grief. So before we move into kind of what's happening next year, I do want you to highlight some of the great speakers, since we're talking about the great speakers that you have. And the keynote speaker, Robert Thurman, is going to be here this year, and he was just fantastic. When you and I sat down and talked with him, I just felt like I wanted to keep him there for 5 more hours. But so why don't we talk about your selection this year of maybe just a couple of people, because there's quite a few presenters that you guys will see if you go to afterlifeconference.com. You can take a look at the agenda. You can see the topics that will be spoken of and presented on and taught about. But why don't you kind of talk about some of your top 3 people who will be at the conference this year?
Yeah, well, I can't really put them in top 3 because I can't really quantify them that way. But in terms of grief, since we're talking about grief, we're going to have on, I believe it's Friday, the day before the conference actually opens, a grief sharing session with Brian Smith, who's around on Facebook a lot. Many of you know who Brian is. There's a picture of him right there. And so that's just a chat. You can just kind of come and hang out and talk with Brian about grief. Thank you for putting this up, April, because I wouldn't remember all these people otherwise. The distinguished gentleman over there to the right of Brian is Ken Doka. He is the senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America. And if you've ever read any academic books about grief, he's probably written half of them. And he is kind of famous for coming up with concepts like anticipatory grief, disenfranchised grief. These are things that people trained in grief counseling can identify, and it's all because of him. So I'm thrilled to have him. Jeff Black, who's right there under Brian, he is an amazing guy. He's a psychiatrist and a shaman and a clinical chaplain, and he treats veterans who are suffering from trauma using shamanic processes. And speaking of shamans, down there just below him is Linda Fitch. She's our resident shaman. She's been with us for many years. And she's doing a workshop on Sunday about going into what the shamans call dream time. So it's how to basically go on an out-of-body journey into the dream world and pull in messages and guidance from your dream. So she's going to give a talk about that on Saturday, and then a separate workshop, 2.5-hour workshop on Sunday. And then back up at the top there, those two people, that's David Steinhorn and Jana Din. I keep wanting to put my finger on there and point on it. I can't do it. David is a pediatrician, critical care pediatrician. This is a guy who is just dealing with the most intense stuff you can imagine every day of his life. And Jana is his partner, who is a shamanic practitioner. And the two of them are working to bring mystical and shamanic practices into hospitals and clinical settings. And so they have an amazing presentation about how they've done this in the emergency room, in the ICU, on the medical floors of hospitals, and used drumming and meditation and journeying to help people cope with their illness or their losses, or whatever they've got. And Robert Thurman, let's go take a look at him, April or Mike, whoever's moving the thing. There he is. So Robert Thurman is, the way I like to describe him is, he's got the Dalai Lama on speed dial. They're buddies. I mean, he's right. the guy in the West who's the expert on Buddhism. I guess I should say it the other way around. Dalai Lama has him on speed dial. So if you're interested in anything about Buddhism, this is the guy you want to see. And so he's doing a keynote presentation Friday night, and also an in-depth workshop, 2.5 hours, on death and dying in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And that's on Thursday. And then go down a little more. I think we have a couple other workshops down there. Austin Wells, who's a medium, she is doing a workshop on Sunday. And Kitty Edwards also on Sunday. Oh, Linda Backman is doing a workshop on past life regression, soul regression, she calls it. And the other two have been canceled. So I think that's all that's on this particular page. So it's, go to afterlifeconference.com. You'll see it all.
Yeah, great. And you can select a general admission ticket, which gets you all those presenters that Terry just explained, the keynote, and then their separate workshops. So you can add to your ticket. So there's a general admission ticket, and then if you'd like to take any of the workshops, you add that ticket on as well. And again, that's afterlifeconference.com. So yeah, it's a great lineup this year. And we have interviewed most of the people on the Path 11 podcast. And I just loved Dr. David Steinhorn and Jana's interview. It was just, phenomenal, like you said, to hear of the work that they're doing with these children and really helping them and the families to transition. They had beautiful stories. So definitely worth it. If you guys would like to hear more, you can go to Path 11 podcast to hear some of those interviews. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about, Terry, was, you would also teach at the conferences. And when we first hopped on board, we were in person. We went to Florida with you, we went to Utah, and then the pandemic hit, and then we went virtual. And I've also been a part of some other things that you've been doing. There was a symposium in January this year. So I can't remember if I heard it on the virtual conference last year or if it was at the symposium, but your talk, when we were in person, I'd be running around in different rooms and you were usually in a breakout room. So I actually never sat through your presentation, but your presentation was called Bereavement and Bad Theology, a Toxic Cocktail. So I had the opportunity to finally sit and listen through one of our virtual events. And it was phenomenal. I mean, I learned so much and didn't even realize that I probably had some religious trauma until I actually heard your presentation. And this kind of takes us a little bit into the direction that you might be moving next year for Afterlife Conference 2.0, as you say. So I remember that I don't know if like controversial is the right word, but you triggered people. I mean, that chat room was like, flying off the handle. I could barely keep up with all the questions and the comments. And, I think that some people might have felt like, oh, you might be attacking my religion, or my God isn't that way, or no, that's not what they teach us in Christianity. Terry, you have it wrong. But you don't have it wrong. And you made some really miraculous points. And I know that your dissertation, your PhD, all that stuff, this is kind of like your bread and butter. So I don't see that on the agenda this year, but maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of what that presentation really captured and what you educated people on, and how bereavement and bad theology can be that toxic cocktail.
Yeah. Well, that symposium that you're talking about, it's something that we're going to start doing every January. So we're going to have the conference every June or July. And in January, the mid-year symposium, which is mostly geared toward professionals, therapists, counselors, researchers. So that I've got one planned for January, on January 30th. If you go to the website, afterlifeconference.com, and hit the subscribe button, you'll be on our email list. So you'll get news of all of that. In these last 10 years of my work, going to school and studying religious history and psychology and counseling and the ancient mystics and, the biblical exegesis, which is the study of how and why things were written the way they were and by whom, and what the political and social scene was in the environment and why it was packaged the way it was, blah, blah, blah. This is what you study in theology school. While I was doing all that, I was also doing hospice work and doing chaplaincy. And I would talk to these patients who would be just desperately scared of dying and really having so much anxiety at end of life because they were afraid they were going to go to hell. Or I would talk to people who were grieving and somebody they love died by suicide, for example, and they believed that that person is going to be in hell for suicide or for some other reason. I encountered lots of people who thought their loved ones were in hell simply because the loved ones weren't Christians. And according to their belief system, if you die before you're saved, you're going to hell to burn consciously in torture for the rest of eternity. So I would see all these belief systems at the same time studying the origin of these belief systems and how they were created by the institutional church as it was formed in the next 200 years after Jesus. Nothing to do with Jesus whatsoever, by the way. And I was seeing all these people really struggling with bad theology. And that became my passion. And that's what my dissertation was on. It's called Toxic Theology as a Contributing Factor in Complicated Grief. And it's been published now in an academic journal, and it's getting a lot of traction. And that is now my platform. And the other thing that I'm starting to notice is that those beliefs that I just mentioned are very extreme and they're very absolute. The people who, this is absolutism or fundamentalism or whatever you want to call it. They absolutely believe this is true. There's no other way. You can't teach them anything. They don't want to hear anything else. At the same time, there are people who have that same absolutism on another end of the spectrum. There are New Age spiritual people who are just as fanatic, if you will. Absolutely, I know that when you die, you go through a tunnel and the light, and I absolutely know that there are angels all around us, and whatever that belief system is, that stuff's not so bad. The bad stuff is the law of attraction and The Secret. I absolutely know that if I think positive thoughts and visualize and manifest the thing that I want, it will come to me. And if it doesn't come to me, it's because I'm not visualizing and manifesting enough or properly. So many people came to me around the time when The Secret was really a big deal. And they said, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. I write myself checks for $1 million. I visualize the house that I want. I meditate and I chase all the dark thoughts away, and I only allow the positive thoughts. I don't do negative self-talk. I only say beautiful things about myself and others. These are the things I'm supposed to do, but my life is still a mess, and I'm still lonely and sick and poor. And, what am I doing wrong? So that's toxic theology too, in a different belief system. And then recently I've gotten involved in a lot of groups of people who identify as atheists. And I see the same thing there. Absolutism and certainty. There is absolutely nothing spiritual in this world. There's no such thing as a mystical experience. If it's not physical and scientifically provable, it doesn't exist. So all these things I have kind of lumped together now as bad theology. And I find that it keeps people separate from each other. I find that it keeps them from being at peace at end of life. Some of those theologies are worse than others. For me personally, the one that says that there is a God in the sky watching over us, that makes judgments and has opinions about what we do and punishes us when we're bad and rewards us when we're good, to me, that's the worst one of all, especially when you've got hell and eternal punishment thrown in. That's just me. So that's where I'm going in my research. That's where I'm going with my teaching. And that's where I'm going with the next conference. So in 2022, it's going to be called the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief. And we're still focusing on death and grief because that's my field. And I'm bringing in people who can talk about this, people who can talk about how those beliefs made their grief process more difficult, or the process of assisting someone who's dying or being with a dying loved one, researchers and experts, people who were raised in really, really intense, what they call high demand religious communities, where they have to dress a certain way, and they can't socialize with anybody outside the community, no television, no magazines, no news, go to church 4 times a week, that kind of thing. So I'm so excited about it. It's a year away. And I'm sure it will offend some people because this is religion we're talking about now. People are very sensitive about it, especially if they're in that kind of rigid belief system. You can't say anything. They think they know the truth about what God is, and they don't. Neither do I. Neither does anybody. One of the best things that was ever taught to me in 10 years of theology school was one of my professors said, when talking about theology, nobody knows what they're talking about. And I love that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and don't you find, though, that our belief systems make us feel safer? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I believe in this absolute and I know, and that's what I've been told, and I am not going to entertain anything else, there's like an illusion of safety, I think, that happens because, well, don't tell me, I'm not going to listen to any other ideas because I know exactly where I'm going to go, and that's what I've been told, and that's what I'm going to hang on to. And one of my teachers always says, belief doesn't get you anywhere. You can believe in something all you want, but where does it really get you if it just remains that belief? So do you feel that as well, that it's kind of beliefs can sometimes be the safety net?
Well, the idea of belief itself is weird because belief should be flexible. It should be open-ended. And so it's a word that I don't even like. Like, I don't even say anymore, I believe in this and I believe in that. What I say is, this makes sense to me. I resonate with that. But it could change. Now, the beliefs that provide a safety net for people, I think, in my opinion, are the ones that make them feel superior to other people. Well, I'm going to heaven because I love Jesus and I accept Jesus as my savior. So I'm safe. I'm going to go to heaven. You're not.
Right.
That's where it becomes a problem. If that makes you feel safe, that's absolutely fine. I have my ideas of what the afterlife is too, and they're all very comforting, and I can't wait to get there. But I would never tell somebody that they should think about it the same way I do, or worse, that they aren't worthy of the beautiful afterlife that I would like to envision. So it's that unworthiness. The other part about that theology too is that you're born bad, original sin. We're stained, we're bad, and we have to be rescued and saved and redeemed before we die. And so people who grow up really steeped in that have a very hard time functioning as healthy, capable adults, because there's so many self-esteem issues. I mean, I'm sure we've all known people, maybe we are people, who've told children things like this. You're bad. You have to, you have to always ask God to forgive you. God is watching you. All people are bad. I mean, it sounds really simplified the way I'm saying it, but this is what I hear from the people that I'm working with who grew up in these religious systems. I didn't grow up that way. Mm-hmm. But and my family wasn't religious at all. They were Jewish, but they were very casual about it. But for some reason, I still had the idea of God as this scary man in the sky. In fact, I tell this story a lot. My grandmother had in her house a portrait of God. Now, when I was like 7 years old, it was this scary looking man, and I always thought it was a picture of God. Turns out, this was about 1960. Turns out it was a picture of Charlton Heston in the movie The Ten Commandments.
Oh, gosh.
I didn't know that at the time. Right. But my grandmother was very Jewish and very religious, and she loved that picture, and it was like the centerpiece of her living room. And I think back on it now, and I recognize it as that picture of Charlton Heston, because you can see it everywhere. So even for me, someone who was raised without religion, I had that scary image that's what God looks like. This angry guy that's just, wipes out the world with a flood and murders children and animals and all the rest of the stuff. Don't even get me started on biblical studies.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear, anyone that's watching live, if you would like to put in the chats, maybe what religion you grew up in, if you're still practicing, or if there are some belief systems that you've broken away from, that would be great. Somebody commented too on fear of judgment when we pass, that this Facebook person is thankful that her mom died with no fear of judgment because she listened to what she had to say without the dogma. She was very sick and knew where she was going, though. So, yeah, any thoughts about that? You were kind of talking about this God that judges, or judgment, and how that, I'm sure that you've seen in hospice and the work that you've done, that some people could also be afraid and hang on and not make the transition as easily because they might be fearful of what's going to happen when they die.
A lot of them do. And I can think of one right now who I was dealing with today, who, and another one I just thought of, that he's over 100. And, he just still, he won't have an advance directive. He still has every intervention. I mean, it's so sad to be so afraid of death. Mm. And so, back moving out of that religious realm into another spiritual realm, that's why we're so lucky right now to have all the information we have on near-death experience, because that takes away the fear of death. Mm-hmm. And people do have hellish experiences when they die and are resuscitated. And that is because when, I'm sort of changing the subject now, but when you die, technically brain dead, and you're pronounced dead, and you go into the afterlife only to be resuscitated and brought back, you're not really in the full-on afterlife. You're just kind of in the doorway. And from the research that we've seen, and there's tons of research being done by brilliant people like Sam Parnia and Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, this is bona fide, legitimate academic research. You carry with you your beliefs and your impressions and your influences from your culture. So, for example, if a Hindu in India dies and has near-death experiences, it's highly unlikely they're going to see Jesus and pearly gates and golden streets and St. Peter. Similarly, a Christian in Iowa isn't going to see the Hindu gods in their afterlife. But that stuff is just when you're just in the door, because then you get pulled back and you come back. It takes some time to shed all of that. And just in saying that, I'm now saying dogma of my own, of like what I think happens. And I'm saying that, but I'm not saying it with any absolutism because I don't know. All I know is what I've read in the research, and it does seem to point to some pretty consistent points.
Great. Yeah. Well, I think next year is probably going to be just as great as these past 11, 12 years have been with this conference. But, the other thing that's going to change are the mediums that you have on. So at the end of every single Afterlife conference, usually each day and before the closing ceremony, the night ends with some of the world-renowned mediums that you have that come. And there's communication. It's a gallery reading. You sit there and you hope you get chosen. You hope your loved one comes through. But that's something that's going to go away. So this is going to be kind of the last chance to possibly sit with Suzanne Northrup and Thomas John are two of the amazing evidential mediums that you have that come to the conference every single year and do a gallery reading for those who present. So, and we should say too that this conference is virtual this year. I don't think that we mentioned that. So you don't have to travel. There's no hotel rooms. There are no flights, and you have 6 months of replays afterwards. So if you can't attend live, you can only attend live for the gallery reading with the mediums. That's great, right? Because you want to be on there on the virtual Zoom room there that we're going to have. But you can watch these presentations and we'll have plenty of time to digest them and watch them over again. So, but can you just explain why you're also moving probably one of the most popular things, right? It's what brings people sometimes to the conference. They just want that message. They hope they're the lucky one. But why is that?
I haven't decided that for sure yet. I'm, right now it's not going to be, and I've moved away from having mediums as the primary thing, because up until about 2014, 2015, I really emphasized the mediums again. And again, I pulled back on that a little bit because I wanted to educate people. I didn't want to just give them candy. I wanted to give them broccoli. I wanted them to eat something substantial and then get the candy, which is the readings from mediums, which is beautiful and evidential and completely wonderful. But I wanted to give, and I lost a lot of people because of that. My numbers really dropped. It built back up again. Next year, I'm not sure how much I'm going to focus on mediumship. I might have a medium do maybe a closing reading. I don't know. The jury's out on that, trying to still figure that out. There's going to be a lot of people in that audience. It's going to be very different. The thing about the Afterlife Conference is everybody in the audience pretty much thinks the same way. We all kind of agree on most basic spiritual things. At this next conference, it's not going to be like that. You're going to have people from all different places in the universe. I mean, I'm putting together my advisory board now. I've got, a Muslim scholar who is a practicing Muslim. I've got a Christian pastor who is still a pastor, but he has publicly rejected the notion of hell and punishment, but he's still in there preaching in the church every day. I've got some very prominent atheists who wouldn't even know what to do with a medium, but it might be fun to put them in front of a medium and see what happens. So
yeah, absolutely.
It's so early I just don't know yet.
Yeah, well, I think you're the best person to probably be that mediator amongst all of them, just with all the research that you have done. So it's going to be wonderful. And this year is going to be wonderful as well. So I really hope that you guys head on over to afterlifeconference.com, get your tickets. This is happening next week. This is our last Facebook Live. So it's June 24th through the 27th. You'll see that some of those days are the personal workshops, right? The workshops, individual workshops with the presenters. And then on Saturday, you'll see the agenda for the full conference. That's the general admission ticket. We also have an opening ceremony and a closing ceremony on Friday and Sunday. So it's a 3-day adventure, and we all have a really, really great time. It's virtual again. So remember the comfort of your own home, which is wonderful, and you get 6 months of replays afterwards. So any closing remarks, Terry? Anything else that you would like to send our people off with today before we leave?
Well, just I'm so grateful to everybody who's been with us all these years, our wonderful audience, our volunteers and people who've helped us, and you and Mike, April, and Carol and Robin who are listening, who've been volunteers with us for years, and everybody who's ever done that. The new conference for next year actually has a website you can check out now, which is real simple, Death, Grief, and Belief.com. It's still a work in progress, but I got it pretty much finalized yesterday just so I could tell you about it today. There's still some pages there you won't be able to see. But for now, the best way to stay in touch and keep up with what we're doing is just go to afterlifeconference.com and click the subscribe button. The Afterlife Conference website will still be there. It's not going away. It's going to exist. It's going to coexist with the new conference. So they're going to be like sisters together in some way.
Wonderful.
Haven't quite figured it out yet.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you. Thanks so much for interacting with us, putting your comments in, sharing some of your stories. We greatly appreciate it. That's what makes Facebook Live so much fun. All right, everyone. So I guess we are signing off, but we're going to see you June 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th. Meet us online, afterlifeconference.com. Pick up your ticket today and join the fun. All right, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.